I knew I was screwed the second he called me sport. We were 42 minutes into the Q3 performance review when Bryce, our new regional manager with the charisma of a used car salesman and about half the ethics, paused his slideshow, tapped his laptop like he was summoning something evil, and said, "Let's address the elephant in the room, shall we?" I was the elephant, apparently. The conference room was packed with 26 people, including HR, the CFO, 2 interns who still thought free pizza was a legitimate job perk, and most of the board dialing in from their corner offices with those fancy light fixtures that cost more than my truck. Bryce cleared his throat with all the fake sincerity of a politician at a town hall. "Warren," he said, oozing that performative regret like syrup on burnt toast. "After a thorough evaluation, we've decided your position is being eliminated. Effective immediately. No warning, no private conversation, no dignity. Just a bullet to the head wrapped in a PowerPoint transition and that smug smile he always wore when he thought he was being clever. 18 years with this company. Started as a junior compliance officer straight out of the Army, back when the office still had those beige computers and coffee that could strip paint. Worked my way up through 3 different reorganizations, 2 mergers, and more layoffs than I care to count. I'd trained half the people in that room, including the intern, who was now staring at her shoes, like she wished she could disappear through the floor. 18 years of showing up early, staying late, reading every policy update, and fixing other people's mistakes. My daughter Sarah got her Stanford acceptance letter 2 months ago. Full tuition, no scholarship. My son Tommy's got an orthodontist appointment next week that'll cost more than most people's rent. The mortgage has 12 more years on it, and my wife Linda's been talking about finally taking that trip to Ireland we've been planning since our honeymoon. And this guy thinks he can erase me with a slide deck. See, here's what you need to know about guys like Bryce. They show up with their fancy degrees and their buzzword vocabularies, thinking they can run a place they've never actually worked. Bryce had been with us for exactly 4 months, brought in from some consulting firm to optimize operational efficiency. That's corporate speak for fire people to make the numbers look better. He'd been making changes from day one, the kind that look good in quarterly reports but make no sense if you actually understand how the business works. Cut the training budget by 30%, then wondered why our customer service scores dropped. Eliminated the overtime approval process, then acted surprised when projects started missing deadlines. But I didn't argue in that meeting. Didn't make a scene. Just nodded once and started packing my things while Bryce moved on to revenue forecasts like nothing happened. The thing about being former military is you learn when to fight and when to wait for better terrain. My access badge stopped working before I made it to the parking lot. 18 years, and I left with a cardboard box of personal items and whatever was left of my pride. That drive home was the longest 23 minutes of my life. Not because I was devastated, but because I was thinking, really thinking, about Bryce's presentation, about the timing, about the way he'd staged the whole thing like some kind of corporate theater. Linda was in the kitchen when I walked in with my box. She took one look at my face and set down her coffee cup. "They let you go?" Bryce did, in front of the whole team. She sat down at the kitchen table, the one we'd bought when Tommy was still in diapers. "What are we going to do?" That's when I should have been panicking. Should have been updating my resume, calling headhunters, figuring out how to stretch our savings until I found something else. Instead, I found myself thinking about something that happened a month ago. I'd been in a cross-department compliance review, the kind of meeting that makes watching paint dry seem exciting. The HR director, lazy as always, had attached the full executive compensation PDF to the meeting notes instead of the redacted version that most of us were supposed to see. Now, most people would have skimmed right past that attachment, maybe not even opened it. But here's the thing about me, I actually read the boring stuff, always have. In the Army, I was the guy who read the entire manual cover to cover, not just the parts that applied to my job. It saved my ass more times than I can count. So I downloaded that PDF. Didn't really know why at the time, just one of those instincts. Filed it away in my random docs folder and forgot about it. Until now. "Give me an hour," I told Linda. "I need to check something." I went out to the garage, cracked a beer, and fired up my laptop. The garage is where I do my real thinking. Got my '89 Mustang out there, the one I've been restoring for the past 5 years. There's something about working with your hands, fixing something that's actually broken, that helps your mind work better. Found the PDF right where I'd left it. Executive Compensation Adjustments, Q2 to Q4. The kind of title designed to make your eyes glaze over. clicked it open and started reading. There was Bryce's name listed as regional manager, performance track. $3 million bonus. $3 million for 4 months of work. But it was the fine print that caught my attention. There was this little asterisk next to his bonus amount referencing Section 4B of the Executive Incentive Agreement. Most people would have stopped reading right there. Corporate legal language is like a sleeping pill for most folks. Not me. That asterisk led to a clause about bonus eligibility being contingent on adherence to internal compliance procedures as defined by quarterly performance review policies and employee separation guidelines. I sat back in my chair and took a long sip of beer. That clause wasn't decoration. It was a loaded gun, and I had a feeling Bryce had just pulled the trigger on himself. I needed to find our current employee handbook, the real one, not the summary sheet they give to new hires. After 18 years, I knew where all the bodies were buried in our policy documents. Found it buried in our shared drive under legacy compliance documentation. Most people never look there because it's mind-numbing stuff, page after page of procedures and protocols written by lawyers who charge by the word. But I'd helped update some of these policies back when I was on the compliance committee, before Bryce arrived and decided committees were inefficient. Section 4B was right where I remembered it, tucked away in subsection 12 of the Employee Separation Guidelines. Let me give you the basic translation. If any executive-level employee fires someone without following proper procedure, meaning private meetings, documented performance issues, HR review, legal sign-off, then that executive forfeits any pending bonus for that quarter. The rule was put in place after a lawsuit 5 years back when some hotshot VP fired 3 people in a department meeting just to make a point about accountability. Cost the company $2 million in settlement fees. The board decided they didn't want managers using terminations as power plays anymore. Bryce had violated every single requirement. No private meeting. He'd fired me in front of 26 people. No documented performance issues. My last 3 reviews were all meets or exceeds expectations. No HR consultation. They looked just as surprised as everyone else. And definitely no legal review. I could check the server logs to prove that. I sat back and finished my beer. $3 million gone because he wanted to look tough in front of the board. But here's the thing. I couldn't just march back in there waving this policy around like a victory flag. That would tip him off, maybe give him a chance to cover his tracks or claim there was some misunderstanding. No, this needed to be surgical, patient, the kind of long-term thinking that separates guys like me from guys like Bryce. So I went full ghost mode. Didn't update my LinkedIn profile. Didn't call anyone to complain or ask for job leads. Let people assume I was sitting at home feeling sorry for myself, maybe sending out resumes and drinking too much. Meanwhile, I was building a case that would make a prosecutor jealous. I opened a new spreadsheet on my laptop and labeled it Project Documentation. Started logging everything I could remember from the past month. Meeting dates, email timestamps, policy violations. Every interaction I'd had with Bryce, every witness who'd been in that conference room. Then I did something most people don't know you can do. I accessed my old company email account. See, our IT department moves slower than Congress. When someone gets terminated, they lock the account but don't actually delete it for 30 days. Security protocol in case there are any disputes or legal issues. And because I still had that old training account with elevated permissions, the one I'd set up 2 years ago when I was running new employee orientations, nobody had remembered to revoke my system access. I spent the next 3 days going through everything. Email chains, meeting invites, calendar appointments. Found a message Bryce had sent to legal 2 weeks before he fired me, asking them to circle back after the Q3 meeting about my advisory status. That email was pure gold. It proved premeditation. He'd planned the whole public execution, probably thought it would make him look decisive to the board members dialing in from their corner offices. But the real smoking gun came when I dug into his other recent activities. Turns out I wasn't his first victim. 3 weeks before my termination, he'd fired Janet from accounting, also in a public meeting. Same pattern. No documentation, no HR consultation, just corporate theater designed to show everyone who was boss. Janet had been with us for 12 years. Single mom, 2 kids, mortgage payment that depended on her keeping that job. She'd taken a severance package and signed a non-disclosure agreement. Probably too scared to fight back against a guy with a fancy title and a legal department behind him. But here's what Bryce didn't know. Janet and I had worked together on the quarterly audit process for 6 years. I knew she was good at her job, knew she'd never done anything that warranted termination. Her firing was just as bogus as mine, and it created a pattern. I kept digging. Found more policy violations, more procedural shortcuts Bryce had taken in his 4 months with us. The guy had been cutting corners and breaking rules since day one, probably thinking he was too important for anyone to call him on it. By the end of the week, I had a file that would make any compliance officer proud. Timeline of violations, witness lists, policy references, server logs showing he'd never consulted with legal or HR before any of his termination decisions. But I still couldn't just dump this on someone's desk. Bryce had built relationships with the right people, had the board thinking he was some kind of turnaround specialist. If I came forward looking like a disgruntled ex-employee with an axe to grind, they'd dismiss me before I got to the good stuff. I needed a different approach, something subtle. That's when I remembered that technically I was still in the system. Our paperwork moved so slowly that my termination wouldn't be processed through payroll for another week. My benefits were still active. My computer login still worked through that old training account, which meant I could still send internal memos. I started with something innocent. Q3. Compliance review. Employee separation protocol updates. The kind of subject line that makes people's eyes glaze over before they even open the message. Sent it to the usual distribution list: HR, legal, department heads, and a few board members who'd signed up for policy notifications. The memo itself was a masterpiece of bureaucratic camouflage. Thanked everyone for their attention to compliance matters during the recent organizational changes. Gently reminded recipients about the importance of following established protocols, especially regarding Section 4B and its impact on executive compensation structures. Attach the relevant policy documents, including a helpful summary of recent advisory situations that might benefit from additional review. I signed it Warren Douglas, Compliance Liaison, Transitional. Vague enough that people would assume it was some kind of handover responsibility. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? It looked like standard corporate busywork from a guy trying to be helpful during his exit process. But I made sure to include just enough breadcrumbs to get the right people thinking about the right questions. Over the next 2 weeks, I sent out 3 more compliance update memos, each one more specific than the last, each one designed to get people asking the right questions without making it obvious where those questions were coming from. The second memo focused on recent organizational transitions and included a helpful flowchart showing proper termination procedures. Attached a few case studies of policy violations and their associated compensation impacts. Nothing dramatic, just boring corporate documentation that happened to highlight exactly what Bryce had done wrong. The third memo was my favorite, titled Q3 Executive Performance Review, Bonus Eligibility Verification Checklist. Send it directly to the CFO's office with a note saying I was wrapping up outstanding compliance items before my departure date. That checklist was a thing of beauty. 27 different criteria that executives needed to meet for bonus qualification. Bryce had failed at least 8 of them, but I made sure to highlight just the obvious ones. Items like all employee separations conducted per Section 4B protocol and legal review completed for involuntary terminations. Meanwhile, Bryce was still strutting around the office like he'd invented leadership. Posted on Slack about embracing change and elevating performance standards. Started calling himself a culture architect in meetings. Even had business cards printed with his new title, Regional Manager, Strategic Optimization. The guy was so busy celebrating his own brilliance that he never noticed the trap closing around him. But I needed more than memos. I needed someone on the inside, someone who could make sure my documentation reached the right people at the right time. That's where Trevor came in. Trevor Hoffman and I had been grabbing beers at Murphy's Tavern every couple weeks for the past 3 years. He was a good guy, smart lawyer who specialized in employment disputes. We'd met at a company Christmas party back when those were still a thing, bonded over our shared frustration with corporate bureaucracy and our love of vintage Mustangs. I called him on a Sunday night, asked if he had time for a beer and some legal advice. Warren, tell me this is either about suing someone or finally selling that Mustang you keep talking about restoring. Option 1, and I've got documentation. We met at Murphy's the next evening. I brought a USB drive and a folder full of printed emails. Trevor ordered his usual Guinness, no food, and listened while I walked him through the entire story. When I showed him Bryce's bonus agreement with that Section 4B clause highlighted, he stopped me mid-sentence and pulled out a yellow legal pad. That clause isn't decoration, Warren. It's contractual language with real teeth. If what you're telling me is accurate, and it sure looks like it is, he triggered the violation himself. Trevor flipped through the evidence for 20 minutes. Email timestamps, policy documents, witness lists, server logs showing no legal consultation before any of Bryce's termination decisions. The fact that he tried to cover his tracks after the fact, Trevor said, pointing to one of Bryce's revised memos. That's not just sloppy. That's potentially fraudulent, depending on who reviewed it and when. I could feel something loosening in my chest. Not relief exactly, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing your plan is going to work. You think we have enough? I asked. Trevor raised his eyebrows. Warren, this isn't just enough. This is surgical. You didn't just catch him breaking rules. You've got a paper trail that leads directly to his bonus clause, created mostly with his own signatures and timestamps. We spent the next hour crafting what Trevor called a legal advisory memorandum. Not a lawsuit threat, not a formal complaint, just a polite professional notice outlining potential compliance issues and their associated impacts on executive compensation. The letter itself was a masterpiece of legal diplomacy. As part of ongoing internal compliance assessments, please note that under Section 4B of the Executive Incentive Agreement, actions outside defined termination protocol may impact eligibility for incentive payouts. This includes immediate separations conducted outside approved HR processes without documented review. Trevor would file it as part of the quarterly legal governance brief, scheduled to be distributed to the board 24 hours before their monthly meeting. Standard procedure that nobody would question. The beauty of this approach, Trevor explained, is that you're not accusing anyone of anything. You're just providing information. Let them draw their own conclusions. While we were finalizing our strategy, Bryce was busy digging his hole deeper. Word around the office was that he'd been bragging to anyone who'd listen about his performance-based restructuring initiatives. Told the board he'd eliminated redundant positions and optimized operational efficiency. Even started bringing donuts to morning meetings like he was some kind of benevolent leader who cared about employee morale. The same guy who'd fired 2 people in public meetings was now trying to play the role of workplace hero. But the best part was when he attempted to cover his tracks. 3 weeks after my termination, he uploaded revised documentation to the HR system. New files that tried to backdate performance reviews and create paper trails that hadn't existed before. The problem was, everything in our system gets time-stamped. I could see exactly when each document was created, who modified it, and what changes were made. His Warren Douglas performance concerns file was dated 2 days after he fired me. His employee separation justification memo had metadata showing it was created the week after our third quarter meeting. It was like watching someone try to forge their alibi while the security cameras were still recording. I downloaded copies of everything. The original files and Bryce's amateur hour cover-up attempts. Added them to my growing collection of evidence. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. That's where Bryce would make his formal request for bonus approval, probably already planning how to spend that $3 million. And that's where Trevor and I would serve him his own policies, perfectly documented and legally airtight. I spent the weekend before the meeting in my garage, working on the Mustang's transmission. There's something therapeutic about taking apart an engine and putting it back together correctly. Every bolt has its place. Every part serves a purpose. And when you follow the manual exactly, everything works the way it's supposed to. Kind of like corporate policy when you actually bother to read it. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of clear sky that makes everything feel possible. I got up early, made coffee, and sat in my garage looking at the Mustang. Every part was finally where it belonged. Engine purring, transmission smooth, electrical system running clean. 18 months of patient work, following the manual exactly, and now it ran better than the day it rolled off the assembly line. Kind of like what was about to happen in that boardroom. Trevor had filed the legal advisory memo exactly as planned, page 7 of the quarterly governance brief distributed to all board members the night before. Standard procedure that wouldn't raise any red flags, just routine legal housekeeping that most executives would skim right past. But not the CFO, not the board chair. These were people who'd been burned before by executives who thought rules were suggestions. I showered, put on my best suit, the navy one Linda bought me for Sarah's high school graduation, and drove to the office for what I figured would be the last time as an employee. Bryce walked into that boardroom like he was accepting a Grammy. Hair perfect, smile loaded and ready, carrying coffee for everyone from that overpriced place downtown. The kind of performative generosity he thought made him look like a leader who cared about people. The conference room looked exactly the same as it had 3 weeks ago when he'd fired me. Same gray walls, same abstract art that cost too much and meant nothing, same polished table that reflected the overhead lights like a mirror. But the energy was different, quieter, more focused. I took my seat 3 chairs down from the head of the table, opened my tablet, and kept my face neutral. Around the room, board members were settling in with their coffee and their copies of the governance brief. Most of them had that early meeting look, slightly glazed, mentally preparing to sit through another round of PowerPoint presentations and budget forecasts. Bryce started with his usual opening joke. "Don't worry, I brought coffee, not termination letters this time." A few polite chuckles from people who probably hadn't read page 7 yet. Then came the presentation. Q3 performance metrics, cost reduction achievements, operational efficiency improvements. The same corporate buzzword parade he'd been running for weeks. Strategic realignment, talent optimization, cultural transformation. All of it backed up with charts and graphs that looked impressive if you didn't dig too deep into the numbers. "I want to thank the board for trusting me with these necessary changes," he said, clicking to a slide titled Leadership Impact Assessment. "I know some of the transitions were difficult, but I believe the results speak for themselves." He spent 10 minutes walking through his accomplishments. Reduced payroll by 15%, streamlined decision-making processes, eliminated redundant positions. All true, if you didn't count the fact that he'd fired good people without following proper procedure and was now trying to take credit for the cost savings. "Which brings me to the compensation discussion," Bryce continued, his smile getting a little wider. "I believe the performance metrics support the bonus structure we agreed on when I joined the company." That's when I noticed the CFO checking his copy of the governance brief. Page 1, page 2, flipping ahead to find something specific. His pen stopped moving when he hit page 7. Bryce was still talking, something about Q4 initiatives and scaling his proven methodologies across other regions, when the door opened. Marion, the board chair's executive assistant, walked in with a manila folder. She moved quickly to the CEO's chair, whispered something I couldn't hear, and handed him the folder before stepping back against the wall. The room shifted. You could feel it, like air pressure dropping before a storm. The CEO opened the folder and started reading. His face didn't change, but his pen stopped moving. Page 1, page 2, then slower as he worked through the legal language. When he reached the attached documentation, I saw his jaw tighten just slightly. Bryce was mid-sentence about cross-functional synergy optimization when the CEO held up his hand. "Let's pause there for a moment." The air got thick. Conversations like this don't happen in boardrooms unless someone's about to get fired or indicted. The CEO turned to our legal counsel, a sharp woman named Patricia who'd been with the company longer than anyone except me. "This advisory memo, was this part of the standard governance review?" Patricia adjusted her glasses and nodded. "Yes, submitted with the Q3 brief. Page 7 references, Section 4B compliance issues flagged during routine policy review." Bryce blinked. "What compliance issues?" The CEO didn't smile. He set the folder on the table like it weighed 50 pounds and looked directly at Bryce for the first time since the meeting started. "Issues related to executive compensation, eligibility, and adherence to termination protocols." I watched Bryce's face process that sentence. Confusion first, then recognition, then something that looked like panic trying to disguise itself as confidence. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Bryce said, his voice just a little higher than usual. "All personnel actions were handled appropriately." The CEO turned toward me. "Warren, you're still here in a transitional capacity. Can you clarify the circumstances of your departure?" Every eye in the room locked onto me. I looked up slowly, keeping my voice level and factual. "I was terminated during the Q3 performance meeting in front of 26 staff members without prior notice, documented performance issues, HR consultation, or legal review. The entire proceeding was recorded per company policy." The words hung in the air like smoke. No drama, no emotion, just facts that couldn't be argued with. Bryce tried to laugh it off. "Well, that's one interpretation. There's obviously more context to the situation." Patricia, our legal counsel, was now flipping through her own copy of the governance brief. "Did legal approve that termination procedure?" Bryce looked around the room like he'd lost his car keys. "I assumed the proper protocols were followed. I delegated compliance verification to HR." "Which HR representative handled the review?" the CFO asked. Silence. "The kind that costs $3 million. "We'll need to examine this more closely," the CEO said. "In the meantime, let's table the compensation discussion pending review." That's when Bryce realized his house was on fire. "Wait," he said, leaning forward. "This seems like a misunderstanding." Warren's situation was handled appropriately within management discretion. The CEO reached for the intercom button. "Trevor Hoffman, please join us." Game over. Trevor walked in 90 seconds later carrying his trademark manila folder. Black suit, red tie, no expression. He took the empty chair next to me without acknowledgement and slid his folder across the table. Inside were copies of everything. Bryce's bonus agreement with Section 4B highlighted in orange. Screenshots of our Q3 meeting transcript with timestamps. Server logs showing no legal consultation before any recent terminations. Email evidence of his attempted cover-up. And a legal summary that was simple and devastating. Based on documented evidence, executive actions constitute clear violation of Section 4B protocols. Bonus eligibility is therefore nullified per contract language. The CEO read Trevor's memo twice. When he looked up, his expression said everything. "You planned this. You waited, and now we're here." I gave him nothing back. No smirk, no satisfaction, just professional calm. Bryce broke the silence with desperation creeping into his voice. "This feels retaliatory. He orchestrated this whole situation." I looked at him for the first time since walking into the room. "I followed company policy," I said quietly. "You didn't." The CEO closed both folders and delivered the sentence that ended Bryce's career. "Per documented violations of Section 4B, your Q3 bonus eligibility is voided effective immediately. $3 million. Gone." Bryce tried to speak, couldn't find words, then tried again. Nothing came out but air. Board members started gathering their papers. Someone asked about transition planning. Another voice mentioned HR protocols for executive departures. I walked out of that building for the last time and drove straight to Murphy's Tavern. Ordered a beer, sat by the window, and watched the corporate world continue turning without me. My phone buzzed. Text from Linda. Sarah called. "She's so proud of you." Another from Trevor. "Justice served. Drinks on me next time." I smiled, finished my beer, and thought about that Mustang waiting in my garage. Every part in its proper place, running exactly the way it was designed to. Sometimes the system works perfectly when you know how to read the manual.